Black History Month, Pastor Baker has asked me to share a legal article I wrote in my final year of law school. This article discusses the connection with history of race relations in the American political and legal system. I was hesitant to discuss this article with you all today because even though it's 100% based on research, extensive research, it is a political piece. I am a supporter of the concept of separation of church and state. I think it's one of the things that makes America unique. But Pastor Baker made a good point in response to my concerns. He told me that currently our history is becoming politicized against us, and it is important that we know what part of history is being targeted and why. I start out by quoting writer Robert Heinlein. He said, "A generation which ignores history has no past and no future." Amen. The title of my article is "The Importance of History, Both the Good and the Bad." My thesis statement is, conservative white America is seeking to erase history of racism in the United States to avoid the important discussion of slavery, race relations, systemic racism, diversity, and race consciousness in this country. History is a vital part of the progression of societies around the world. Many people would agree that history allows us to understand the mistakes from the past and learn from them to create a brighter future. The United States of America is a country that is rich with history of many cultures, traditions, and accomplishments. The country has experienced centuries of technological and societal advancements that have aided the world in progressing. These advancements are important because they show beacons of pride in America. Though American history contains many beacons of pride, it also harbors many beacons of shame. While many Americans have no problem applauding the accomplishments of their country, many of the same Americans struggle to simply acknowledge the history of atrocities that the United States has been responsible for committing. The discussion of the country's history of racism and slavery is a hard topic for many white Americans to tolerate. Winston Churchill once famously stated, "History is written by the victors." Many people have heard this quote stated, but few have taken the moment to understand the significance of it. The first victors of the United States were the white elites of colonial America. The quote points to the fact that history can be taught through the lenses of many perspectives. The quote also points to the fact that many important parts of history can be overshadowed depending on who wields the historical pen. Amen. Throughout many classrooms in America, history is discussed through the lens of the victor. The curriculum taught to kids is selective and subjective about what is taught and what extent each topic is discussed. Children are taught about the American Revolution and the founding of America. They are taught about the courage and the resolve of the founding fathers. The fact that the wealth of most of these prominent men was secured off the backs of enslaved people is something that is quickly brushed over. George Washington's estimated net worth was $594.2 million in today's currency. His fortune came from inheriting the 8,000-acre Mount Vernon and 123 slaves. Thomas Jefferson's net worth was $239.7 million in today's currency. Being the owner of 2 plantations with about 150 to 200 slaves largely contributed to Jefferson's wealth. These men believed in the principles of freedom, liberty, and equal representation, yet they were slave owners. Why is this irony not discussed more in depth within history books and classrooms? Why is it that America struggles to acknowledge the sins of the past? In the preamble of the U.S. Constitution, the Founding Fathers expressed the goal of their radical experiment in democracy. Racial justice, however, was not included in that list. Instead, they embedded protections for slavery and the transatlantic slave trade into the founding document, guaranteeing inequality for generations to come. To achieve the noble aims of the nation's architects, we, the people, have to eliminate racial injustice in the present. But we cannot do that until we come to terms with racial injustice in our past, beginning with slavery. In recent years, racial injustice and police brutality has sparked a movement to be more progressive about what history should be taught within U.S. school systems. Following the death of George Floyd, racial disparities and inequality of Black Americans became center stage in the topics within American society. There has been a push to be more transparent about the realities of slavery and racial injustice in the United States. The country has seen an outpouring of public remembrances of slavery and growing academic focuses recovering the memory of slavery in the U.S. North as well as the South. Many different educational theories and academic literature have been examined to understand the best way to have an open and honest discussion about America's history of slavery and racism. The progressive push has been met with heavy backlash from conservative white America. In response to the progressive attempts toward racial equality and healing, conservative white America has chosen to utilize progressive theories such as the critical race theory and the 1619 Project to create a false narrative about what the benefits of teaching about America's history of slavery and racism is. This article will discuss what led to the moment of conflict about what history should be taught in America. To get a clear understanding of why this conflict is occurring, it is important to understand the theories that white conservative America is using to create a false narrative. The article will first discuss what critical race theory is and why the theory is being misused in conservative white America's attempt to create history of race, to erase the history of racism in the United States. The second theory that will be discussed is the 1619 Project. This article will look into what the 1619 Project is and what makes this project unique. After discussing both theories, this article will evaluate why it is that conservative white America opposes both theories, as well as the teaching of the history of racism in America. So what is critical race theory? To understand why this theory has caused discomfort for conservatives, it is important to define it. Critical race theory is an outgrowth of the civil rights movement in critical legal studies, asserting that U.S. law is based on racial distinctions, many of which were created by the law. The law perpetuates a power structure privileging some racial identities and cultures over others. And that genuine equality and justice cannot occur in law until this structure is recognized and its inequities remedied by giving power to the previously disadvantaged. There are 6 tenets that define the core foundation of critical race theory. First, critical race theory presumes that racism is an entrenched feature in American society. Second, critical race theory explains that white elites tolerate or encourage racial progress for minorities as long as it promotes white interests. Third, critical race theory challenges these dominant legal theories that promote hierarchy or neutrality that are based on the notion or claims of colorblindness within American society. Fourth, critical race theory builds upon legal theories such as liberalism, feminism, and law in society. Fifth, critical race theory asserts a unique perspective by recognizing storytelling and narrative as vital to legal discourse about people of color. And sixth, critical race theory has influence across racial groups and influenced the development of additional legal frameworks aimed at exposing inequality. Of these 6 tenets, conservative white America has focused its attack on the assertion that racism is an ordinary and entrenched feature in American society. They just don't believe that, and they don't want you to believe that. In critical race theory, and the challenge that critical race theory is to the legal theories that promote claims of colorblindness in American society. Conservative white America wants you to believe that colorblind America is the best for all of us. The origins of critical race theory derive from student activism on the prestigious grounds of Harvard Law School. This activism was sparked in resistance to the dominant legal education system with the goal of cultivating alternative spaces where law students could learn how to tackle and dismantle the seemingly permanent structures of subordination in the United States legal system. The goal of these law students looking into the permanent structures of subordination was to understand how race has influenced the laws and decisions made within our legal system. Though it is known that critical race theory is a legal theory, it has been widely publicized that critical race theory is actively being taught in K-12 public schools around the nation. This notion is false. Regardless of the invalidity of this publicized assertion, conservative white America continues to push this false narrative as truth. Discussion of racism being entrenched in American society is unnerving to them. As a result, any dialogue of white privilege and racism all have been falsely branded as critical race theory. Though the current state of politics is continuously blurring the lines between fact and fiction, it is imperative that truth prevails. Whether one believes critical race theory is good or bad, knowing what it is vital to making an informed decision about how one perceives it. The next theory of discussion is the 1619 Project. What is the 1619 Project? The project is a piece of journalism that was created and published by Nicole Hannah-Jones and other writers from the New York Times and the New York Times Magazine. The project was created in August of 2019. The name of the project was meant to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first slaves brought from Africa to the Virginia colony. The project was meant to highlight the significance that slavery had on the founding and the rising power of America. The project's goal was to get Americans to see slavery in a more inclusive lens in the originating fabric of the nation. The project sought to achieve this goal by reframing the country's history, understanding 1619 as our founding, and placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the center of the story Americans tell ourselves about who we are. For decades, the extent of the influence of slavery on the development of America has been sugar-coated and minimized to the important topic that is understanding the true history of our country. The 1619 Project boldly addresses some of the ignored realities of slavery's connection to economic and political decisions made in the founding of America.
Yes.
Every student has heard the phrase, no taxation without representation. You've all heard it in their history classes. Students are taught that the founders chose to fight for independence because Britain refused to allow colonies to have fair representation in parliamentary decisions. Many of the founders feared being enslaved by Great Britain. The 1619 Project does not attempt to deny this claim, but rather pushes its readers to consider other compelling reasons why the founders made the decisions to rebel. One of the reasons stated is that the founders wanted to break off from Britain, is that they're afraid of Britain beginning to regulate slavery or maybe even abolish it. It is not incidental that 10 of the first 12 presidents of the United States were slave owners.
Amen.
Students are taught about the triangle trade, but educators do not emphasize the significant connection that the rum trade had on slavery. The 1619 Project discusses how the rum trade was really the currency of the slave trade. Educators do not emphasize the fact that both the northern and southern colonies worked jointly with each other to advance the enterprise of slavery. The 1619 Project explains the shipbuilders were northern shipbuilders. The people who were sending voyages to Africa to bring enslaved people here were in the north.
Yeah.
This was a truly national enterprise. But Americans prefer to think that it was just some backward Southerners, because that is the way that we can kind of deal with our fundamental paradox. That at our beginning, that we were a nation built on both inalienable rights of man and also a nation built on bondage.
Yes.
Students have been taught about the rise of the banking industry in cities like New York City. But they are not taught about what supported the industry's rise. The banking system in New York City rose to prominence through financing the slave trade. Students know that the financial center for the United States is Wall Street. But educators do not discuss how Wall Street acquired its name. The 1619 Project explains that Wall Street is called Wall Street because it was on that wall that enslaved people were bought, and sold. That's been completely erased from our national memory and completely erased from the way we think about the North. The 1619 Project also discusses slavery's connection to the healthcare system of the country. The project gives a detailed account into the horrors imposed on slaves by their enslavers. Slave owners were using enslaved people to do these medical experiments. But also they were using medical technology to justify slavery by saying enslaved people don't feel the pain that white people do. That people of African descent don't feel the pain that white people do, that they have thicker skin. And so you can beat them, you can torture them, and it's not going to hurt them as bad. These ignorant assertions have no merit. Yet even in modern medical science, some of the doctors today still use some of these false calculations. It is evident that the 1619 Project's discussion of hidden historical realities is a hard pill to swallow for historians who only wish to see the nation's founding as great. So why does conservative white America oppose the teaching of critical race theory in the 1619 Project? Conservative white America has made it their mission to prevent the teaching of the history of racism in K-12 schools. While the public has listened to the endless criticisms about these theories, conservative white America has failed to prove any of the claims they have made. Understanding why conservative white America is adamantly opposed to the discussion of slavery in the classroom is essential to understanding their true motive. The false narrative that conservative white America is alleging is that critical race theory and the 1619 Project are racist theories that are meant to fuel hatred between Americans. Across the country, this attack has taken the form of a brutal assault on critical race theory. The 1619 Project, anti-racism, and intersectional theories, and all the ways of thinking critically about race relations, systemic racism, and race consciousness in this country. Conservative white America has used media to spread the lie that these theories are unpatriotic and claim that the white people are racist just for being white. This is an outrageous claim, not backed by any fact. These theories are about institutions, not individuals. I repeat, these theories are about institutions, not individuals. Critical race theory has been around for decades. The theory was produced from postgraduate studies seeking to understand the influence of race within our legal system. This connection was not being evaluated to fuel hate, but rather to create an understanding and positive change. But many Republicans and right-wing media have co-opted this term, and they're using it as a catch-all way of describing basically any conversation about race or racism that makes white people uncomfortable. So conversations about white privilege, having dialogues about anti-racism, these are all branded falsely as critical race theory. The 1619 Project has been labeled as critical race theory as well. The project was created to help Americans come to terms with slavery's impact on the development and wealth of America. Somehow broadcasting factual history that has evaded the American psyche has been labeled as racist attempts to divide the nation. The reality is, conservative white America is afraid to acknowledge the sins of our nation's past. Yeah. They have deeply ingrained opposition to the reality that racism is an ordinary and entrenched feature in American society. They are even more fearful of how challenges to the dominant legal theories promoting the claims of a colorblind America will affect their political power. It is often said that slavery was our country's original sin, but it's so much more than that. Slavery is our country's origin. Amen. Slavery was also our country's Achilles heel, responsible for its near undoing. When the Southern states seceded, they did so expressly to preserve slavery. These statements are simple truths that conservative white America cannot stomach. Yes. That does not change the fact that slavery played a substantial part in the development of the United States. Amen. The central role that slavery played in the development of the United States is beyond dispute. And yet, we the people do not like to talk about slavery, or even think about it, much less teach it or learn it. Amen. The implications of doing so unnerve us. It is the goal of conservative white America to preserve the facade of endless greatness and success in American history, instead of coming to terms with the mistakes of the past. Conservative white America has continued to propagate this lie to the American public. Their propaganda has been effective in convincing many Americans that the discussion of the history of racism of America will make their children hate themselves. Fear has been the tool used by conservative white America to elicit cooperation and preserve the status quo. The blaring reality of conservative white America's actions is that they are afraid of how positive change for minorities in America would affect their influence in the political realm of this country. The Black experience is something that pains conservative white America to evaluate. The Black experience is an inconvenience to the false narrative that conservative white America wants every American to believe. So when you think about the story of who we are supposed to be this country built on individual rights. We are the country where if you come from a place where you are not free, you can come to our shores and you can get freedom. Well, then you have Black people. And every time you look at Black Americans, you have to be reminded that there was 1/5 of our population who had no rights, no liberties, no freedom whatsoever. This reality is not meant to make white Americans feel bad. This reality is meant to create understanding through acknowledgement and elicit positive changes for minorities who have been inherently disadvantaged from the history of racism in America. Americans need to understand that just because part of history makes you feel uncomfortable, it does not mean that that history should not be discussed. Amen. Racism and slavery are not wholesome and positive topics, but it is important for Americans to understand how both subjects continue to affect minority populations within America. America expresses the ideals of freedom, liberty, equality, and justice for all. But not every American has received these rights equally. No one values freedom more than those who have never had it. And while the founders were writing these lofty and aspirational words, even as they knew they were going to continue a system of slavery, Black people had no choice but to believe in the literal interpretation of those words, that all men are created equal and born with inalienable rights. And so Black people really, from the moment they landed on these shores, have been resisting and trying to push towards a society, toward a more equal society of universal rights. Americans should be pushing for a more equal society of universal rights. Progression of positive ideals of freedom, liberty, equality, and justice for all will only lead to a more united and positive society. The propaganda perpetuated by conservative white America cannot prevail because their claims only serve to divide this nation. It is important that Americans begin to reckon with the past, because if they do not begin to do so, these false claims by conservative white America will begin to blur the important truths of our country. Our preference for nostalgia and for a history that never happened is not without consequence. We miseducate students because of it. Although we teach them that slavery happened, we fail to provide the detail or historical context they need to make sense of its origin, evolution, and legacy. And in some cases, we minimize slavery's significance so much that we render its impact on people and on the nation inconsequential. This minimization only helps to sustain conservative white America's agenda. So what are the benefits of teaching the history of racism? Regardless of the claims by conservative white America, there are amazing benefits that come with teaching children the history of racism in America. Discussion of the history of racism allows students to learn about how inequality in this country still informs inequality that people experience today. Having opportunities to grapple and reckon with the nation's history allows students to analyze how power imbalances perpetuate division and oppression. so that they may dream a path forward towards a world rooted in justice, love, and connection. Education can open minds to progressive concepts meant to rid the nation of inequality within American society. Despite a legislative push to ban critical race theory, the 1619 Project, educators are committed to helping students examine the systems in which we all work, live, and help for a better future for everyone. These school policies and tailored curriculum have advocated not just for the progression of and the fight against inequality in this country, but also for the fight for teaching the truth. American children will not benefit from the notion of a colorblind society being pushed by conservative white America. In fact, studies have been shown that discussion of racial differences is beneficial to children. In a 1997 study by Katz and Copton showed that babies as young as 6 months gave special attention to unfamiliar faces of a different race more than unfamiliar faces of their same race. They see color. They see color. By the age of 3 to 5 years old, children begin to categorize people by race and show some bias towards certain races. Education is the only way to ensure that these biases are removed so that the racial divide does not continue to move forward inequality in American society. Teaching children to be colorblind eliminates the beautiful diversity of our communities. We inevitably reinforce that sameness is good and difference is bad. Children grow up believing that because race wasn't talked about, it has no value in their conversations as they mature. America has an obligation to uphold these values of racial equality, diversity, and acknowledgement of racial injustices of its past to prevent American children from continuing the cycle of racial injustice in this country. It is the responsibility of parents and educators to promote the benefits of diversity and teaching of the history of racism in America. In conclusion, Americans have the opportunity to broaden the founders' vision, making racial equality real. But Americans can no longer avoid the most troubling aspects of our past. Americans have to have the courage to teach hard history. Conservative white America's attempts to divide white Americans and black Americans must be stopped. It is important to understand that white Americans are an essential ally to the fight for racial equality in America. White Americans can help by simply acknowledging the history of racism in this country and showing compassion for an experience that they will never fully grasp or understand. Conservative white America will continue to attack any American who seeks to do this. But it is important that Americans continue to promote progress and racial equality. This starts with standing up against the racial injustices seen throughout the nation. The fight for racial equality will always be under attack by conservative white America. But Americans need to continue to advocate for change regardless of personal attack. Recently, white Michigan State Senator Mallory McMorrow came under attack for promoting the teaching of the history of racism in America. Her response to falsely being accused of grooming children is a sentiment that should be held by each and every American, white American. She stated, I am a straight, white, Christian, married, suburban mom who knows that the very notion that learning about slavery or redlining or systemic racism means that children are being taught to feel bad or hate themselves because of it is absolute nonsense. No child alive today is responsible for slavery. No one in this room is responsible for slavery, but each and every single one of us bears the responsibility for writing the next chapter of history. We decide what happens next and how we respond to history in the world around us. We are not responsible for the past. We also cannot change the past, but we cannot pretend it did not happen or deny people their very right to exist. Hate wins when people like me stand by and let it happen. I will not. Americans cannot let hate win. Americans cannot let conservative white America continue to divide us. Americans have an obligation to truly uphold the principles of liberty, equality, and justice for all. To do this, Americans must acknowledge the history of racism in the country and work towards a better future for all. Thank you.
Come on, one more time. Splendid. You know how much we are over in slavery? I didn't say 1,000. 22, not 1,000, not millions. I didn't say billion.